The show that we're doing this year is called Fractured, and it's all about art inspired by conflict. All of the artworks here relate in some way to Vietnam. We had tried to get some artworks on loan relating to some of the past conflicts in Malaysia, because we thought that would be interesting for the local audience, but actually very difficult to do that. And that was during the Japanese occupation that had an impact here on Penang, and then during the Malayan emergency, which was the communist insurgency of the 1960s. And there are some very interesting artworks that were created at that time, but they're extremely scarce and we were unable to find them. So we have 4 bodies of work here. The first body of work is from a collection that I've made over many years called Witness Collection. And Witness Collection consists of modern and contemporary art since the 1920s in Vietnam. And we have works here from about 12 different artists from Witness Collection, and I'll talk you through those. The second body of work that we have are the sculptures that you see here. And we have 11 sculptures from a Canadian artist called Blake Ward. And Blake in 2003 was the first Western artist to teach at the Fine Arts College of Vietnam after the end of the French colonial period. That experience for him was fascinating in that he'd studied in Paris, he'd studied classical figurative sculpture. Vietnam was one of the few places that was still following the classical French curriculum, and they were very happy to have him there. And after the period that he was teaching, he travelled through Vietnam and Cambodia and was actually shocked to see that even nearly 40 years after the war had ended, there was still a massive impact from unexploded ordnance, from landmines, and people were still dying 30 plus years after the war had really finished. So he made this body of works as a way of actually bringing attention to particularly landmine victims, and also a portion of the proceeds from these works, each one of which is named after a different landmine, went to raising funding for landmine clearance and also victim support. And so far this series has raised over $350,000 and has enabled mines to be removed in Cambodia, in Vietnam, in Kosovo. The third body of work we have is from a very unusual artist, George Burchett. George is Australian, but was actually born in Hanoi in 1955 and was one of the, if not the only Westerner to be born in North Vietnam, as it was at the time. And his father was a very well-known journalist, Wilfred Burchett. George grew up as an artist and lives in Hanoi still today, and created a series of works inspired by the Viet Cong girls, and it was really about the resistance in Vietnam. And so we're showing those works alongside pieces from the original battlefield images that were made during the wartime. And then the fourth set of work we have is a little bit different, but it still relates to conflict. We run a youth art prize in Vietnam every year, and that's for artists under the age of 26. And this year's winner, Phan Kế An, joined us for 3 weeks here in Penang as part of the prize, and we're exhibiting 4 of his works, which are contemporary digital pieces printed onto film. And those works reflect not so much relating to the war in Vietnam, but relating to conflict in society as that continues today. So that's the bodies of work, and then maybe we can walk around a little and talk about some of the individual works.
Sounds great, thank you.
So starting with this piece, this is a lacquer painting, also known as a coromandel. So it's a carved lacquer. In Vietnam, lacquer is used not only for decorative items such as boxes and screens, but is also used as a fine art medium, and it's fairly unique in Asia, where it's used to make original one-off artworks as a fine art form. So this particular piece relates to the villagers supporting the uprising against the French at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which was in 1954, when the Viet Minh defeated the French very unexpectedly, and it really became the end of French colonization, not just in Vietnam, but in the rest of the world as well. And at first, when you look at the artwork, it's not apparently anything to do with conflict, and it appears to be the minority tribal groups, some villagers that are going off to market or going home. It's hard to tell. And then if you look a little closer, you'll see that they're carrying munitions. So you'll see the shells, which are camouflaged there above the baskets. You'll see the rocket-propelled grenades, which are lined up also on the rack there, and you'll see ammunition boxes being carried. So it's a very subtle sign, and a little bit reflects the reality of what happened in the wartime in Vietnam, both against the French and against the Americans. And that was really a case of it was everyday people who were fighting the conflicts. It wasn't just the official uniformed military. So we thought this was an interesting piece to start with. Probably a good time to talk about the sculptures next, as they're what we're passing by. One of the things that struck Blake, the artist, when he was first in Vietnam, is that when we see fractured bodies and victims of war, it's not something that we always associate with beauty. And yet if we think about the ancient sculptures and carvings that came out of maybe ancient Greece, ancient Rome, even though frequently we'll see them with limbs missing, we still look at them in museums and we still admire how beautiful they are. And so the irony of this is something that struck Blake, and he felt that the irony really was about creating an artwork only for it to be destroyed. And so in fact all of these artworks that we see here were created as full figurative sculptures, and then he allowed the clay to dry, and as the clay dries it starts to crack. Ordinarily you'd make a plaster cast, and then you'd prepare to cast into bronze long before the clay had dried out. But he allowed the clay to dry, so you see the cracks that have formed in the sculptures. And then he would sometimes take a mallet to it and tap on the sculptures, and then maybe a limb would drop off or a head would drop off. And he described it, his objective was to make sure that he didn't end up with a pile of dust. So very easy, just had to be very gentle with the mallet. And then once the sculptures had been fragmented, then he would create the casts and subsequently pour the bronzes. Each piece is named after an individual landmine, and they're landmines of every nationality: Russian, Chinese, American, French. And the idea behind that really was just to remind us that also with war, where man is making something only to destroy himself. And that was really the parallel between the sculpture and what it was trying to represent. And this series has been exhibited in Hanoi, in Phnom Penh, in Singapore, in Siem Reap, near the temples of Angkor Wat. This was the first time we were able to show it here in Malaysia. So these two art pieces, one is a lacquer by the Vietnamese artist Nguyễn Thế Vinh, and the piece next to it is by an artist, Kim Thai, a woman artist. And really, they're both reflecting on the same subject, which is the role that women played in the war in Vietnam. And in fact, that's a sub-theme of the exhibition that we have here. And when the war took place, not only against the French, subsequently between North and South and involving the United States and Australia, it wasn't just men fighting the war. Women played just as important role, and some would say even more important role, in terms of what they had to do, whether that was taking up the jobs that the men who'd gone to the front line were engaged in. Many of the women were involved in self-defense. They were involved in anti-aircraft brigades, and so we've got these images here, both a service woman and here a minority tribeswoman carrying their rifles and actually taking combat roles during the war. Now, although these are in some ways quite serious artworks about conflict, you can see also that Kim Thai was also experimenting a little bit. And at the time in Vietnam, socialist realism had been imposed as a style on the artists, writers, so painters, and that was obviously part of the cultural ideology that was imposed by the authorities in North Vietnam. And what it meant is that artists sometimes felt somewhat constrained, and they did occasionally get books and materials and find out what was going on in other countries, and sometimes they wanted to experiment with that, but had to be a little bit careful about that. So if we look at the piece on the right, it also reflects the fact that materials were very scarce. So actually the portrait of the woman is painted on top of another painting underneath. And we don't know exactly, we'd have to x-ray it really to know the details of the painting underneath. But we can see that she has deliberately left some of the background to come through, maybe as a way of allowing her to experiment without being seen to be too bourgeois in terms of what she was trying to achieve with the artwork. And yet it's ended up with quite an interesting and colourful composition here. So this series of works that we move on to now, these are all lacquer paintings, and although they all have wartime themes, they were all created after the war ended in most cases. So the piece on the left, which is about the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, this actually represents the capture of the French generals, General de Castries, and the French forces at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. This piece was made actually about 30 years later. Partly the reason for that is during the wartime, materials were very scarce. So most of the works that were made during the wartime were made only on paper, and also the conditions were such that the artists were in the fields. They didn't take lacquer materials or canvases with them. So many of the works they made based on their sketches that they'd originally created during the wartime. The piece to the center here that we have is made by a minority group artist, Zuman, made in 1960, and you can see the tribal people kind of proudly looking at the flag from North Vietnam, and there's the portrait of Ho Chi Minh in the background, and it shows that not only was it the ethnic Vietnamese group, the King group, but also the minority people who were very much part of the struggle for independence. The piece we're now looking at is a lacquer triptych by artist Nguyễn Văn Bình. Nguyễn Văn Bình was one of the first generation artists trained by the French at the Indochina Fine Arts College. And this piece is actually representing the Ham Rong Bridge. Vietnam is a sort of S shape, and most of the interior of the country in the center part is mountainous, and that meant that sending supplies from Hanoi down to the south involved sending them along a thin coastal strip before they would then go into the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which travelled down through the mountains and latterly into Laos and Cambodia and back into South Vietnam. So there was this very strategic river crossing where the Ham Rong Bridge existed, and so this was very heavily bombed during the wartime and was a major target. So you had many anti-aircraft positions around the bridge, and inevitably the bombings of the railway there were successful. And so here we can see the workers reconstructing the railway, but we can also see them recovering the engine of what's almost certainly an American bomber that's been shot down, and that's what's being depicted here. What's also notable is the socialist realism style, the exaggerated muscularity of the workers and the very square jaws. And that's really, I think, quite reflective of the type of art that was being produced in North Vietnam at the time. And we can also see on the mountainside there's the writing Quit Tang, which is really encouragement about moving onwards for victory in the wartime here. So this series of work are all battlefield images that were made during the war. The artists used to carry paper and usually just some very simple materials. It might have been a small watercolor palette or some Chinese ink and a brush. And they typically have a metal tube that they would roll their papers up into so they could run with their materials, and it would survive the rains and the wet conditions that they often encountered. This particular image we're looking at is very interesting because the iconic image of the war in Vietnam, or the American War as they call it, the Second Indochina War, that was the Huey helicopter. And it's something that we've all seen many times, whether it was the film footage or newspaper photos of the era, or subsequently with Hollywood's version of the war in Vietnam. So each of these helicopters would have had a door gunner, and this particular image was made in a place called Cu Chi, which is where the tunnels were just outside Saigon. And the artist in this case, whose name is Trương Hiếu, was an intelligence officer, and he would have absolutely been one of those targets in an area which would have most likely been a free fire zone in Củ Chi. So this was a very dangerous image for him to make. At any time, any of those helicopters could have targeted him. So you can see how incredibly quickly he's worked with the brush, and he's actually captured very much an iconic image of the war. And yet to see artworks created of the American helicopters in flight by the North Vietnamese side is extremely rare. So this is a very, very rare piece from the North Vietnamese side, made here in 1970. The same artist in these two images was really showing the stealthy movement of the soldiers moving across, in this case, part of the Mekong Delta. They're moving across the monkey bridges, and all that southern part of Vietnam is incredibly wet, a lot of rice fields, marshlands, mangrove swamps, and so it was not always easy to move around, and you can see them moving here in the twilight, and the artist actually has captured really the feeling of the moment in a very expressive way. So we come on to two pieces by the artist Nguyễn Ðức Thọ, and Nguyễn Ðức Thọ was trained with a missile brigade in the north of Vietnam, and I believe also spent some time in Soviet Union. And his role was to document his unit. He traveled down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This particular piece on the left, we can see it says Nhà Mới, which means new house. This is in the Trường Sơn Mountains in the center of Vietnam, just near Quang Tri. And you can see that the tree trunk is hollowed out, and actually they were using it as a place to stay. And at the time there would have been very heavy spraying of defoliants and also very heavy bombing in this area of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So this was a sanctuary for them. And the second piece by the same artist was made in February 1972. And what it depicts is celebrating Tet, which is the Vietnamese New Year. So in spite of it being the war going on, they still used to try and get their ingredients to make their special food, and they'd celebrate in the same way that we might celebrate Christmas or 4th of July in the US. And this was a very important holiday to them. So even though it's the war, they still continued with their traditions in the jungle, and I think this picture depicts it very well. So we come on to a series of works here by the artist Nguyen Thanh Châu. And Nguyen Thanh Châu, although he was with the North Vietnamese military, he spent most of his time in the far south in the Mekong Delta. The first piece on the left shows them crossing through a forest in the south in 1971. The following year we've got the depiction of the resistant soldiers in the mangrove swamps, again of the Mekong Delta in 1972. And the final piece that we have on the end here is possibly one of the most interesting. This is made in the last 1 or 2 days of the war. So the war ended 30th of April 1975, and this is the final assault on Saigon. And we can see the rainy roads, we can see the sky lit up by the explosions of the munitions and the Russian tanks, or Soviet tanks, the T-54s, coming with the North Vietnamese army down the road to encircle Saigon. And this is really one of those last images that was made of the war just a day or two before. And finally, we have a piece by an artist, Thái Hà. Thái Hà was actually very famous for his lacquer work, in particular his carved lacquer, Coromandel lacquer. And he spent so many years of his life in the jungle that he became extraordinarily talented at depicting the forest and depicting all the different plants. But many of his lacquer works he made after the war ended, as we noted earlier. And this is one of his original pieces that was made in the U Minh forest, right down in the southern tip of Vietnam, in Cà Mau, made here in December 1966. And what sometimes happened with the artists, the colours look quite fresh, and it wasn't uncommon that the artists would create the works just using pen and ink, because that was all the material that they had. And then later on, when they returned to their studios, they'd apply the watercolour to colour in the images, and that's what we believe was the case in this work here. So alongside the battlefield artworks that we have from what the Vietnamese would call the American War, we have a series of contemporary works made in 2014 by George Burchett. George was born in Hanoi in 1955. His father was covering the war as a war correspondent and was based in the north, one of the only Western correspondents who was able to cover the war from the northern side. Wilfred had made a name for himself by being the first Western journalist into Hiroshima after the atom bomb dropped on Hiroshima, and gained access to the north as he had in Korea during the Korean War. So George was very unusual in having his initial experience. First language he spoke was Vietnamese, and his life subsequently took him to Phnom Penh, to Paris, to Moscow, and spent a good number of years in Australia. He's an Australian citizen. He moved back to Hanoi some years ago, and really inspired by his knowledge of the history and also by his father's writing and photography, he created this series of works about the VC girls, Viet Cong girls, and the role that they played during the war. So we thought it would be nice to show these alongside the historical works. So in terms of the wartime images, we have these two which are maybe hard to connect with why they would be associated with the show that we're doing, Art Inspired by Conflict. As we can see, they're both abstract works. They were created within about 6 months of each other. So the piece on the left was created by an artist called Tati at the end of 1974. The piece on the right was created by Tho Ngoc Tang in around about May 1975. And the artist on the right was living in Hanoi, and he'd in fact been born and grew up in Hanoi. His father was a very famous artist in Vietnam called Tho Ngoc Vinh, who died at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. And the artist on the left, Tati, although he was born in the north and attended the Fine Arts College of Indochina, he moved south in the 1950s. And Tati was a pioneer in cubism and abstraction in Vietnam. And as the war went on, his work became more and more abstract, until at the end it became very difficult to understand the meaning of it without some sort of guidance from the artist. So Tati was a senior member of the psychological warfare department of the South Vietnamese military, and he would have known what was coming with the forces encircling Saigon. He would know that the war was coming to an end. We see a large block of blue, about a third of the artwork, and then an upper block of green, about 2/3, and then the small orange square with the white line. So the artist connected this with a famous book at the time, and the blue represents the past, the green represents the future, the orange represents the present, and maybe we can imagine that the white line represents a rupture that the artist could feel coming sometime in the near present, passing into the future. And we can also see a kind of horizon on the blue, almost like he doesn't know what's going to happen when he drops over into the future. And the reality is that after the war ended, end of April 75, the artist was arrested and spent 9 years in a re-education camp in the north of Vietnam. Eventually left Vietnam as one of the boat people, and I think very appropriately for this exhibition, he ended up sailing to Malaysia and sadly spent 2 years in a refugee camp in Sungai Besi in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia before being resettled to California. And he lived out most of the rest of his life in California before passing away in 2004. I was fortunate to spend a little time with him in the last months of his life, and we were able to talk about some of his artworks that we'd collected dating back to the 1940s. The piece on the right is also the artist wanting to experiment with abstraction, but as we saw earlier, in the north, socialist realism had been imposed on the artists, so actually he was very constrained in what he was able to do, and he felt that he had to be able to justify why he was creating an abstract painting. So what we see here is, actually he described this as being at least to the senses. He described this as being an artwork depicting the crowds in Saigon celebrating the end of the war. And we can see the flags of North Vietnam, although he's sort of very faintly done created the yellow star. And you've got the white placards. But in reality, all he wanted to do was, with the war over, he felt there would be a little bit more freedom to experiment with abstraction. And that's really what this painting is about. It's another abstract piece. So the idea of putting these two together was to show that from the opposing sides, the artists really had quite different ideas as how they approached abstraction, albeit at about the same time. So the works we're looking at here are those on the walls, and these are composite digital images. The artist Phan Kế takes a lot of original photographs and then he composites them to create the composition and the idea that he wishes to create. And very much part of it is the idea that when things happen in the past to us, our memories that start off as being very vivid, they become over time more and more confused, and more elements and layers can intertwine, and we don't always have quite such clear memories as we maybe think we do. And that's a little bit what these artworks are depicting. But at the same time, they're also depicting conflict in society. So one of the things that you notice if you travel in Vietnam is that everywhere you go, there are cables hanging above you in the streets, and these are power cables, phone cables, these days internet connections. And because these cables are sort of strung up down the street level, what often happens is people might cut into the neighbour's electricity supply or into their phone connection. It's a source of social conflict in many of the cities. Increasingly, they're starting to bury the cables underground, as happens in most developed countries. And so really these images here are capturing a moment in time, which is the present and just the recent past, where you still get these incredible spaghetti tangles. And they're really a sort of reflection on that and the conflict in the densely packed cities that are connected with that. The pieces on the right here are much more rural in nature. The images were taken in the countryside around Hue, which is the former royal capital, former imperial capital, where the emperor was based, and that's where the artist grew up and lives. And we often hear stories about the farmer's land being taken for development, with the country growing very rapidly, new roads being put in, new towns being planned. And there are often stories about conflicts over compensation for land use and so on. We can see the rice growing in the fields here, and then various other layers that we have within the images. And really these are representative of some of the conflicts which happen in the rural environment. So I think we'll finish off with the painting that we have as our entry piece for the exhibition. This is a lacquer made by Hanoi artist Phan Kế An. Phan Kế An is still alive today, about 94 years old. He's one of the last surviving artists of the Indochina first generation, who was taught by the French. In spite of being taught by the French, he was also plotting against the French. And at the time the Second World War ended, the French, due to the Japanese occupation of Vietnam, or Southeast Asia, had been very much weakened in their position, and the French military had been consigned to its barracks. Their weapons were seized and stored away. And Phan Kế An and a number of other artists, among the things that they did were to break into the French weapons caches and steal weapons for the emerging Viet Minh, who were fighting originally against the Japanese occupation and then subsequently against the reassertion of French colonial authority over Vietnam. So this painting depicts something from much later. This is the Christmas bombing of Hanoi in 1972. The Christmas bombing occurred in the lead up to the peace talks in France that were due to try and end the war between North and South. Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon decided on a strategy of bombing the northern cities as a way of applying pressure on the North Vietnamese before they started the peace talks. And it was particularly intended to try and reduce the amount of infiltration of soldiers from the north into the south. And this resulted in very heavy bombing and destruction of Hanoi. One of the reasons why the center of Hanoi survived is that the Vietnamese would move their American prisoners of war around the center of Hanoi to try and reduce the amount of damage to the city. And this is reflecting one of the areas, one of the suburbs of Hanoi that was very heavily bombed. But we can also see the shot down bomber. There's the logo of the US Strategic Air Command on the right. So this is quite possibly a B-52 bomber that had been shot down over Hanoi, of which quite a few were. And although the piece was made in 1985, it's got the two dates, 1972 to 85, conditions were very, very harsh towards the end of the war in the early and mid-70s. And so it was only 10 years after the war ended in 1985 that the artist had the opportunity and the materials available to make this painting. But the Christmas bombing of 72 is something that sticks very strongly in the minds and memories of all the Vietnamese who lived through it. And so this is actually reflective of a very important period for the Hanoians.
Thank you so much for your time. This has been wonderful.
Pleasure.